Although the world's focus has been squarely on the airfields inside of Russia, a bridge going into Crimea, and the battlefields of Ukraine, soon, at another site on the opposite side of Europe, there will be a meeting that may very well determine the fate of the continent. Welcome to The Hague, the seat of the government of the Netherlands, and the site of this year's NATO Heads of State Summit. It is an annual tradition where the leaders from every NATO member come together to set the agenda for the world's most powerful alliance. Even many of NATO's partner countries show up too. But this year, there will be a lot of new faces, and a corresponding shift in priorities. We do not yet know what the result of the meeting will be. That is what the meeting is for. But all signs are pointing to a single number. 5. As in 5%. As in spending 5% of GDP on defense. Something that has not been seen in decades. Actually, no, you have to go further back to the older Bush. But the 5% number is all over the media ecosphere at the moment, and it was an informal topic of discussion at the Defense Ministerial Summit held in early June, meant to prepare the agenda for the main event. Consequently, 5% will, at the very least, be a central topic of discussion at the Hague Summit, if not a new policy. So, today, we put that 5% number front and center, looking at the history of NATO spending, what exactly a 5% spending commitment would look like in today's context, and whether member states will follow through on their pledge. First, though, let's rewind just a bit to mid-May. Trump had been lobbying for 5% since re-entering office, but the NATO Foreign Ministers Conference held in Turkey that month was the first indication that the target was serious. Germany, the heavy hitter on continental Europe, came out in support of the measure. It thus turned from a Trumpian fantasy to something worth spending time debating. Around that time, a whole bunch of other countries came out of the woodwork, and that is when things started to get weird. You could already see the political coalitions forming here. There is criticism of the measure from both the traditional political left and traditional political right. Where the left supports raising military spending, the benefit is framed at deterring Russia. Where the right supports raising military spending, the benefit is strong national security. And, quickly capturing this kind of nuance is simple with the sponsor of today's video, Ground News. A few clicks, and you can see how different parts of the political spectrum are covering the same story. Or you can just look straight at the comparison. And by going to ground.news/linesonmaps, or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take a fantastic 40% off their Vantage plan. Wow, that discount is 8 times bigger than the hypothetical new NATO target. And let's not even try looking at how much cheaper it is than the total value of US military spending. But even at that price, you still get access to the News Bias feature and a whole bunch more. So thanks again to Ground News for their continuing support of this channel. We should rewind a bit further to get better context of what 5% spending means. Now, the threshold you are likely familiar with is not 5%, but rather it is 2%. And the history of 2% is a good starting point for where world affairs are today. Let's hop back in time one more time, more than a decade. The year was 2014. Ukraine was in the midst of a revolution, and Russia took the opportunity to annex the Crimean Peninsula while Kyiv was distracted. Along with that came a shadow war in the Donbass. It was a wake-up call for the West, though the alarm would ultimately prove to not be loud enough. Western leaders looked at the peace dividend from the end of the Cold War, and concluded that they had given Russia too long of a leash. The United States, still under Barack Obama, was especially frustrated with the situation. Every country, the United States included, had scaled back its military spending since the Soviet Union fell, but the alliance was becoming increasingly dependent on Washington's outlays. Indeed, in 2014, NATO military spending totaled $910 billion. $660 billion of it was American, leaving just $250 billion from Canada and Europe. American presidents had complained about this type of discrepancy for decades, even well before the Cold War had ended. Military spending in this context creates an incentive to free ride. Social scientists call it a collective action problem. which is fitting because NATO describes itself as a collective security organization. You see, all countries see their security increase whenever a single country increases its military spending. Unfortunately, that means that the individual country does not internalize all of the benefit of military spending, but they do have to absorb the entire cost. As a result, countries tend to spend according to their own needs, leaving overall spending below what would be socially optimal. Thus, a country like the United States, which envisions itself as a global superpower, still buys a lot, 3.38% in 2024. Meanwhile, a country like Spain, insulated from much of the risk by being in Europe's westernmost end, spends little, just 1.28% in 2024. The alliance would be better if both were spending more, but the individual incentives stop that from happening. It's basically a prisoner's dilemma if you are familiar with that. However, 2014 was finally a breakpoint. The aforementioned annexation of Crimea shocked the alliance into action, and indeed, the now common tradition of a Ukrainian leader at a NATO summit was in full effect. The site was Newport, Wales. This is the same annual summit that will be held later this month in The Hague, as the hosting country varies each year. And like how people a decade from now may talk about the Hague Summit, national security folk remember well what happened across the channel back in 2014. There, U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel championed what became known as the Wales Pledge, setting each member's military spending goal to 2% of GDP. In theory, that would be enough to deter Russia and its expansionist aims that had been newly revealed. Keep in mind that the Baltic countries had only joined NATO a decade earlier, which back then may have left some lingering questions about their integration into the alliance. However, 2% felt like a stretch goal at the time. Only 3 countries were above that threshold in 2014: the United States, the United Kingdom, and the oft-forgotten heavy-spending Greece. To make matters worse, European and Canadian defense spending had been trending the wrong way, dropping by 2.7% in 2012, another 1.3% in 2013, and contemporaneously dropping by 0.9% in 2014. But hey, at least the second derivative was going the right way. The plan called for a 10-year ramp-up to the target, giving members some time to work through the financial trade-offs to pay for everything. After all, a pledge is one thing, follow-through is another. And much like everything else in international relations, the words alone meant little. To complicate matters, Obama would soon find himself term-limited out of office. Thus, the tracking of the trajectory toward the 2% target turned to Trump. Back then, Trump's rhetoric retrospectively reflects his recent remarks, basically that Europe free rides too much and that it needs to stop. But progress was slow-moving. By 2021, only 6 countries had met the threshold. Although growth rates were broadly trending in the right direction, Europe's urgency was not commensurate with the threat. 2022 marked a turning point, though. Putin's announcement of a special military operation made the 2014 annexation look tame by comparison. European countries scrambled to raise their spending. This time the message was clear. Expenditures sharply increased in both 2023 and 2024, and by 2024, 23 of 32 countries were at the 2% threshold. Actually, it is arguably 31 because Iceland does not have a military and thus does not quite count. Croatia, Portugal, Italy, Canada, Belgium, Luxembourg, Slovenia, and Spain still lagged behind, but even they had grown significantly since 2014. That said, the forthcoming problem for today is that 2% is no longer sufficient in the eyes of many NATO leaders. Remember, 2% was the target for a world where Russia was exploiting short-term vulnerabilities in Kyiv to capture peninsulas. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine was a fundamentally different beast. It showed that Russia was interested in a much greater chunk of Europe. 2% is better for the continent, of course, than, say, 1%. But that 2% is not enough anymore. That takes us to what will happen in a couple of weeks at The Hague. Recall that when Donald Trump first floated 5% as the new target a few months ago, commentators were quick to dismiss it. Indeed, no one is currently spending that much. The United States is at 3.38%. It is Poland that leads the alliance by dialing it up to 4.12%, having really stepped it up from 2014 levels. The bulk are hovering just over 2%. For a historical comparison, the last time that the United States spent 5% of GDP on defense was 1990, while it was coming down from its Cold War highs. And keep in mind that an impending invasion was juicing those numbers. Even at its peak spending from Afghanistan and Iraq in 2010, the United States never went past 4.9%. For a present-day comparison, Russia sits at 7.1%, while in the middle of the largest land war in Europe since World War II. Bear in mind that, depending on the measurement, NATO's GDP is something like 8 to 25 times larger than Russia's, so the alliance would crush the Kremlin even at a lower rate. It should be noted that Ukraine leads the world in this category at 34.5%. The joys of being invaded. In any case, it now seems that there is a movement to some sort of 5% minimum, even if a consensus will have to wait for The Hague. Indeed, Secretary General Mark Rutte wrote each NATO leader stating that he expects such an increase to be discussed, and then one imagines announced, at the summit. And his press conference at the Defense Minister Summit confirmed that 5% will be the next main agenda item. Then again, though, the new target may not be as simple as a single number. For one thing, we will not be seeing 5% in 2026. Just like the 2% target, there will be a phase-in period. And given that this is a 3 percentage point jump, it could last a while, perhaps 2032 as the final target. There is also an expanded definition of military spending. For an apples-to-apples comparison, the new spending target may actually be 3.5%. The missing 1.5% would be a commitment to defense-related expenses. Cybersecurity may be a part of it, which would make sense given the evolving nature of national security threats. A more mundane outlet for that spending is infrastructure. At the risk of stating the obvious, a tank is only useful if you can deliver it to the location where you need to use it. Well, Germany appears to have a bridge problem. Some of the bridges that Germany ought to use to transport tanks cannot handle them, and by some, I might mean a third of them. Thus, Germany can use the additional 1.5% to make upgrades to resolve the problem. In fact, Germany has long argued that such expenditures should count toward the NATO targets, and now it seems that Berlin may be getting what it wants. Including infrastructure allocations makes sense for practical reasons, but it may also make the pill politically easier to swallow. How many times have you heard leaders talking about how they want to spend more money on infrastructure? Well, now they have a NATO-approved excuse. That said, some of what countries count toward the existing 2% would shift over to the 1.5%. This is a breakdown of spending by all members. Infrastructure ranges from 0.3% from Finland, Greece, and Sweden, to 11.3% from Lithuania. Consequently, we are still looking at a de facto increase of more than 1.5% overall. And that transitions us to our final point, whether 5% in any form will come to fruition. Remember, it is 2025, and coming into the year, there are still a bunch of countries not meeting 2014's 2% target. There are two subpoints worth expanding on here. First, inevitably, the new bump will be sold as an economic stimulus plan. Here is the basic narrative. Governments raise spending, more money circulates into good jobs, and the economy ends up better off as a result. In reality, though, that is not how it works. The money a country spends has to come from somewhere, which ultimately points back to the taxpayer. There are plenty of situations where even deep deficit spending is good economic policy, but putting it in the military is a bad idea in a vacuum. That is because there is no direct return on the investment. Materiel, by its very definition, is destructive. The only reason you build it is because you have assets you need to protect. If you really wanted to stimulate your economy, you could pump the full 5% into infrastructure, which would yield an actual return on the investment. Of course, NATO countries do not live in a vacuum. There is still Russia to deter, and the Kremlin does not give a damn about your dam. Moreover, and without getting too deep into economic theory, a tax's inefficiency increases exponentially in the size of the tax. The basic intuition is that taxes distort both supply and demand incentives, mess with two dimensions, and the loss squares rather than increases linearly. My subpoint is that going from 2% to 3.5% is actually more painful than going from 0% to 2%. And that makes for a nice transition to the second subpoint, how to enforce the increased spending. As you know, that is the central problem of international relations. Rules are rules. Without external enforcement, you had better hope the rules are self-enforcing if you want people to follow them. Consequently, I suspect that the headlines coming out of the summit will emphasize what 5% would mean for the alliance, but the enforcement question will be a footnote, even though they should be on the same tier. The upshot is that the alliance is actively aware of the problem. You could see it from the Secretary General's comments at the earlier press conference, that not much happened right after the Wales Pledge. There started to be a correction the first time Trump came into office, but that this type of spending cannot be for an audience of one, because there are 1 billion people along the North Atlantic to defend. And the fact is that no one has a magic wand to solve the problem. Now, abandonment threats would be the normal way to counter the free riding incentive. If you are not paying dues to a club, usually the club prevents you from entering. But if a Russian fire starts to spread in Europe, countries are going to feel compelled to fight it, regardless of whether the target is current on its payments. Never mind the bigger problem that NATO is supposed to be a unified front against any opponent that would attack a member state. And we have seen in recent years what threats to abandon members, or otherwise, have done to that unity. One wonders how Trump will respond when countries struggling to hit 2% suddenly find themselves short by another 1.5 to 3 percentage points. I suppose the silver lining here is that Trump's term will end long before states are supposed to have hit that threshold. But it does open the door to some combative politics. Or, alternatively, an unusually happy Trump, who sees himself as the person that finally oversaw Europe taking defense spending seriously. That is why, if I were at the conference, I would be very curious about the enforcement aspect. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to take a great 40% discount on a Vantage plan. And if you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.